Before she stood in the inner court. Before she walked uninvited into the presence of the most powerful man on earth, knowing that the law of the empire could put her to death for the act of approaching him without being summoned. Before she said the words that would require more courage than any battlefield demanded of any soldier, "If I perish, I perish." Before any of that, there was an exile. A displacement. A people carried far from their homeland, living in a foreign empire, maintaining their identity in the midst of a culture that did not share their God or their covenant or their history. Living with the particular vulnerability of a minority people in a majority culture that held all the power and all the weapons and all the legal authority and that could, at any moment, decide that the foreign people in its midst were more useful as a problem to be solved than as a community to be tolerated. This is the world of the Book of Esther. Not the world of the Exodus, where the divine power was visible in fire and cloud and the parting of the sea. Not the world of the conquest, where the walls fell and the enemy was routed by the direct intervention of heaven. Not even the world of the prophets, where the word of the Lord came explicitly and publicly and with the full weight of divine authority behind it. This is a different world. A quieter world. A world where God's name is never mentioned, not once, in the entire Book of Esther, does the name of God appear. And yet the presence of God is everywhere in the story, in the timing, in the coincidences, in the reversals, in the extraordinary chain of events that turns what should have been the annihilation of an entire people into the salvation of that people through the courage of a young woman who had every reason to remain silent and chose instead to speak. The story begins with a feast. Not a small, intimate gathering but a feast on the scale that only the ancient Persian Empire could produce, the empire that at its height stretched from India to Ethiopia, encompassing 127 provinces and the greatest concentration of human power in the ancient world. Esther 1 verse 1, Ahasuerus, known to history as Xerxes I of Persia, the king who ruled the empire from approximately 486 to 465 before Christ, held a banquet for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. Esther 1 verses 3 to 4, 180 days. 6 months of display. 6 months of demonstrating to the assembled power of the ancient world the extraordinary wealth and the magnificent glory of the Persian court. The feast was not primarily about enjoyment. It was about power, about the visible, sustained, impossible to ignore demonstration of what it meant to be the ruler of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. And when those days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. Esther 1 verse 5, 7 days more. The garden feast for all the people of the citadel, the ordinary residents and officials of Susa, the administrative capital of the empire. Couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. Esther 1 verses 6 to 7, everything in the court of Ahasuerus was superlative, the most precious stones, the most elaborate surfaces, the most lavish provision of wine in golden vessels. The empire expressed itself in material extravagance of a kind that the ancient world had never seen in one place. And at the same time, Queen Vashti was giving a feast for the women in the royal palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. Esther 1 verse 9, Vashti. The queen whose name means beautiful, a woman whose courage, paradoxically, would create the vacancy that Esther would fill. On the 7th day of the feast, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded his 7 eunuchs to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. Esther 1 verses 10 to 11, to show the peoples and the princes her beauty. The king, in the full intoxication of 6 months of power display, wanted to add his wife to the exhibition, to display her as one more magnificent possession, one more expression of the royal glory that had been on display for 180 days and 7 more. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. Then the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Esther 1 verse 12, she refused. The queen, in the presence of all the assembled power of the Persian court, refused the command of the king. The refusal was an act of extraordinary personal dignity and equally extraordinary political consequence. In an empire built on the absolute authority of the king, the public refusal of the queen to appear at the king's command was a challenge to the fundamental structure of imperial authority. The king was enraged. And his rage, channeled through the advisors who understood the political implications of what had just happened, produced a decision that would ripple outward through the entire empire and eventually bring a Jewish orphan girl named Esther to the most powerful position available to a woman in the ancient world. The advisors said, Queen Vashti has not only wronged the king but also all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt. Esther 1 verses 16 to 17. The political calculation of the advisors communicated the nature of the power structure they were protecting. The fear was not merely about Vashti's personal disobedience but about the precedent it set. If the queen could refuse the king's command, what would every wife in the empire conclude about her own authority to refuse her husband? The domestic and the political were understood to be continuous in the ancient world. The hierarchy of the empire was reflected in and reinforced by the hierarchy of the household, and a crack in one was a crack in both. So the advisors counseled that Vashti be deposed from her position as queen and her royal position given to another who was better than she. Esther 1 verse 19, and the king agreed. And letters were sent to all the royal provinces declaring that every man should be master in his own household. Esther 1 verse 22, the deposition of Vashti created the vacancy. And the vacancy created the process. And the process, the gathering of beautiful young women from throughout the empire to Susa for the king's consideration, the year-long preparation, the beauty treatments and the cosmetics and the careful presentation, was the process through which a Jewish orphan girl named Esther would come to the attention of the most powerful man in the ancient world. Now there was a Jew in Susa the citadel whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives carried away with Jeconiah king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar king of Babylon had carried away. Esther 2 verses 5 to 6, Mordecai. The genealogy matters. He was a Benjaminite, from the same tribe as Israel's first king Saul. And his family had been among the exiles carried to Babylon by Nebuchadnezzar, the deportation that had removed the leadership and the artisan class of Judah from the land of the covenant and scattered them across the empire. Mordecai was a man of the exile, living in Susa, the capital of the empire that had succeeded Babylon, maintaining his Jewish identity in the heart of the most powerful Gentile empire in the world. He was bringing up Hadassah, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and her mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Esther 2 verse 7, Hadassah. The Hebrew name, meaning myrtle, the fragrant flowering shrub that grew in the hills of Israel. And Esther, the Persian name, connected by some scholars to the Persian word for star or to the name of the Babylonian goddess Ishtar, the name she used in the Persian world, the name by which history would know her. Two names. Two identities. The Hebrew girl and the Persian woman. The daughter of the exile maintaining her Jewish identity in secret while presenting a Persian face to the world around her. She was an orphan. Both parents dead. Raised by her older cousin Mordecai as his own daughter, the household of exile reconstructed around the bonds of family loyalty that sustained a displaced people's identity and survival far from the land of the covenant. And she was beautiful. Lovely in form and appearance. The beauty that would bring her to the attention of the process that was now underway throughout the empire, the gathering of young women to Susa for the king's consideration. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered to Susa the citadel in custody of Haggai, Esther also was taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. Esther 2 verse 8, Esther was taken. The passive construction is significant. She did not volunteer, did not present herself, did not seek the position that was about to be thrust upon her. She was taken. gathered with the other young women from throughout the empire, brought to the palace at Susa, placed in the custody of the man who oversaw the women's quarters. The process that had begun with Vashti's refusal and the king's decree was now encompassing this Jewish orphan girl, moving her from the relative obscurity of Mordecai's household into the most scrutinized and most dangerous environment in the ancient world, the inner court of the Persian king. And the young woman pleased him and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. Esther 2 verse 9, she found favor. The word that runs through the Book of Esther like a golden thread, favor, grace, the unearned goodwill that opens doors that should by rights have remained closed. Esther found favor in the eyes of Haggai. She would find favor in the eyes of everyone who saw her. And ultimately, in the moment that would determine whether her people lived or died, she would find favor in the eyes of the king. But the favor was not random. It was not merely the product of physical beauty, though beauty was part of it. It was the expression of a character, a quality of person, that the Book of Esther communicates not through explicit description but through the consistent pattern of how people responded to Esther across the entire arc of her story. Esther had not made known her people or kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. Esther 2 verse 10, she was living in concealment. Her Jewish identity, the deepest truth about who she was, the identity that connected her to the covenant people and to the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, was hidden. Mordecai had told her to keep it secret. The practical wisdom of a man who understood the dynamics of the Persian court and the vulnerability of a Jewish woman in that environment. Do not reveal your people. Do not reveal your kindred. Be Esther the beautiful Persian woman. Not Hadassah the Jewish orphan from the exile. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. Esther 2 verse 11, every day. The faithfulness of the older cousin who had raised her as a daughter, walking the perimeter of the place where she was held, unable to see her, unable to speak with her directly, but present. Watching. Maintaining the connection of care across the boundary that the palace walls created. Every day. The loyalty that would eventually produce a crisis and then a salvation, the same loyalty that Esther herself would demonstrate when the moment of testing came. Now when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulations for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil of myrrh and 6 months with spices and women's cosmetics, when the young woman went into the king in this way, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem in custody of Xerxes, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go into the king again, unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. Esther 2 verses 12 to 14, the process communicated the nature of the position Esther was entering, not merely a beauty competition but a permanent commitment. The young women who went to the king went once and then waited in the second harem for the rest of their lives, summoned only if the king chose to call them by name. There was no going back. No return to ordinary life. Whatever happened in the king's presence determined everything that followed. When the turn came for Esther the daughter of Abihail the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter, to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. Now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. Esther 2 verse 15, she asked for nothing except what Haggai advised. In a process where every other young woman presumably brought her best calculation of what would most impress the king, her finest jewels, her most elaborate preparations, the most carefully chosen presentation of herself, Esther brought what the man who knew the king best advised her to bring. Not her own judgment. Not her own calculation. The wisdom of the person whose knowledge of the situation exceeded her own. The same humility and receptivity to guidance that had characterized her relationship with Mordecai expressed itself in her relationship with Haggai. She did not rely on her own understanding of what the king wanted. She trusted the person who knew. And the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. Esther 2 verse 17, the royal crown. The position that Vashti's refusal had vacated. The place that the process had been designed to fill. The Jewish orphan girl, the daughter of the exile, the child raised by her older cousin, the woman living with her identity concealed, became the queen of the Persian Empire. Not by her own ambition. Not by any strategy of self-promotion. But by the extraordinary chain of events that had begun with a queen's refusal and a king's anger and an empire-wide decree and a gathering of young women, a chain of events that, viewed from outside the text, looked entirely like the working of human politics and human power. But viewed from within the story, with the knowledge of who Esther was and where she had come from and what was about to be required of her, looked like something else entirely. Looked like Providence. The king gave a great feast in honor of Esther, a feast for all his officials and servants. He also granted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Esther 2 verse 18, the celebration of Esther's coronation was empire-wide, the kind of public, lavish, politically significant event that communicated the new queen's elevated status to every corner of the Persian world. From the citadel of Susa to the outermost provinces, the name of Esther was now known. The Jewish orphan girl had become the most visible woman in the most powerful empire on earth. And she was still keeping her secret. Esther had not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. Esther 2 verse 20. She obeyed Mordecai. The relationship between the older cousin and the new queen had not changed with Esther's elevation. The girl who had followed Mordecai's guidance in the harem continued to follow it in the palace. The woman who wore the royal crown of Persia still listened to the man who walked every day along the perimeter of the court to learn how she was. The faithfulness and the loyalty that had characterized their relationship from the beginning of her life was still intact at the height of her power. In a world where elevation so often produces the abandonment of old loyalties and old relationships, Esther maintained hers with a consistency that communicated something essential about her character, that the position she occupied had not changed who she was. And Mordecai, sitting at the king's gate, Mordecai had a position at the king's gate, the public space of the palace where officials and petitioners gathered, the civic center of the imperial court, became aware of a conspiracy. Two of the king's eunuchs, Bigthan and Teresh, who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told it to Queen Esther, and Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. Esther 2 verses 21 to 22, Mordecai discovered the conspiracy. He told Esther. Esther told the king. The king investigated and the conspiracy was confirmed and the two men were hanged on the gallows. And it was recorded in the Book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. Esther 2 verse 23. Recorded in the Book of the Chronicles. A detail so apparently minor, so easily overlooked in the sequence of the narrative, that a casual reader might miss it entirely. But the Book of the Chronicles of the Persian king, the official record of events in the empire, the document read to the king when he could not sleep, would play a role in the story of Esther that could only be described as the fingerprint of divine providence. The record of Mordecai's service in saving the king's life was written down. And then, apparently, forgotten. No reward was given. No official recognition. Mordecai did what was right, he reported a threat against the king through the channel available to him, and received nothing in return. The service was rendered. The record was made. And life at the Persian court continued. After these things King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. And all the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage. Esther 3 verses 1 to 2, Haman. The name that would become synonymous in Jewish tradition with the hatred of God's people, a name that would generate the ritual noise-making of Purim celebrations for millennia, the name shouted down by the community every time it was read in the synagogue, because in the community's memory this was the name of the man who had tried to destroy them. Haman the Agagite. The genealogy was significant. He was descended from Agag, the Amalekite king whom Saul had spared against the explicit divine command and whose sparing Samuel had confronted as the final act of Saul's disobedience. 1 Samuel 15 verses 8-9, the ancient enmity between the Amalekites and Israel, rooted in the attack on Israel's weakest members during the wilderness journey, was still present in the Persian court in the person of Haman and his hostility toward Mordecai. The king had commanded that everyone bow to Haman. And everyone at the king's gate bowed, everyone except Mordecai. Then the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, "Why do you transgress the king's command?" And when they spoke to him day after day and he would not listen to them, they told Haman, in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. Esther 3 verses 3-4, he had told them that he was a Jew. Mordecai's refusal to bow to Haman was rooted in his Jewish identity, in the theological reality that the God of Israel was the only one before whom ultimate obeisance was owed, and that bowing in the specific manner commanded by the king to a man who was the descendant of Israel's ancient enemy was something his covenant identity would not permit. He told them he was a Jew. The identity that Esther had been commanded to conceal was the identity that Mordecai publicly claimed as the ground of his refusal. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow down or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury. But he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the whole people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. Esther 3 verses 5-6, he sought to destroy all the Jews. The fury of a man whose pride had been wounded by a single individual's refusal to bow expanded immediately into a plan of genocide, the elimination of an entire people from the empire. Not because the Jewish people had done anything to Haman. Not because they represented a political threat or a military danger. Because one man had not bowed. And the hatred that Haman bore for Mordecai was the surface expression of a deeper, older, more comprehensive hatred, the hatred of Amalek for Israel that had been running through the biblical narrative since the wilderness journey. In the first month, which is the month of Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, they cast that is, they cast lots, before Haman day after day and month after month till the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Esther 3 verse 7, they cast lots. The ancient Persian practice of casting lots to determine the most auspicious time for an undertaking. Haman, planning the genocide of the Jewish people, consulted the lots to determine when to execute his plan. And the lot fell on the 12th month, Adar. 11 months away. 11 months between the casting of the lot and the appointed day of destruction. 11 months that, from Haman's perspective, was simply the waiting period before the execution of his plan. But from the perspective of the story, and from the perspective of the God whose name does not appear in the Book of Esther but whose hand is visible in every detail, 11 months was exactly the time that would be needed for everything else that had to happen. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom. Their laws are different from those of every other people, and they do not keep the king's laws, so that it is not to the king's profit to tolerate them. If it please the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, that they may put it into the king's treasuries." Esther 3 verses 8-9, a certain people. Haman did not name them. He described them, scattered, different, refusing the king's laws, in the language of the threat they supposedly posed to imperial unity. And he sweetened the proposal with an extraordinary financial offer, 10,000 talents of silver, a sum so enormous that it represented a significant fraction of the empire's annual revenue. He was willing to pay for the privilege of destroying an entire people. And the king took his signet ring from his hand and gave it to Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you, the people also, to do with them as it seems good to you." Esther 3 verses 10-11, the money is given to you. The people also. The most powerful man in the ancient world handed over an entire people, the Jewish people scattered throughout his empire, to a man who hated them, with the full authority of the imperial signet ring to do with them as he pleased. The decree was written. The letters were sent to all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate all Jews, young and old, women and children, in one day, the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. Esther 3 verse 13. Destroy. Kill. Annihilate. All Jews. Young and old. Women and children. In one day. The comprehensive, total, empire-wide nature of the decree left no room for ambiguity or interpretation. This was not a political suppression or a civil limitation on Jewish practice. This was the planned elimination of an entire people from the face of the empire, a genocide decreed by the most powerful government in the ancient world, authorized by the king's own signet ring, communicated to every province from India to Ethiopia. And the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. Esther 3 verse 15, the city that had just celebrated the coronation of its new queen was now in confusion over a decree of genocide against the people from whom that queen had come, a fact the city did not know and that the queen herself had been commanded to conceal. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and his decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. Esther 4 verses 1-3, Great Mourning. Throughout the empire. The Jewish people who had survived the Babylonian exile and had been scattered across the Persian world were now facing the prospect of their complete annihilation, decreed by the government of the empire in which they lived, authorized at the highest level, with 11 months remaining before the appointed day of execution. And Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, and the queen was deeply distressed. She sent garments to clothe Mordecai, so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Esther 4 verse 4, she sent garments. The gesture communicated both the genuine care of a daughter for the man who had raised her and the practical concern of a woman who understood that Mordecai in sackcloth could not enter the king's gate and she needed to communicate with him. He would not accept them. The grief was too real, the crisis too urgent, the sackcloth too necessary as the external expression of what was happening internally, the community's anguish in the face of the decree that had just been sent throughout the empire. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why. Esther 4 verse 5, she needed to understand what was happening. The queen who lived in the most privileged and most protected space in the empire needed a messenger to cross the boundary between the women's quarters and the king's gate to bring her the information that was available to everyone outside but not to her inside. The palace that gave her power also gave her isolation. She was informed only of what reached her through the narrow channel of the people assigned to attend her. Hathach went to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him all that had happened to him, and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay into the king's treasuries for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. Esther 4 verses 6-8, command her. Not ask. Command. The man who had raised her, the man whose guidance she had always followed, was commanding her to do the most dangerous thing available to a woman in the Persian Empire. To go to the king. Uninvited. Without being summoned. To appear in the inner court and approach the throne. And Esther gave him a message from Mordecai saying, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king into the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except the one to whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come in to the king these 30 days. Esther 4 verses 10-11, 30 days since she had been summoned. 30 days since the king had called for her, 30 days during which the relationship between the king and his newest queen had not included a royal summons. The law of the empire was unambiguous: approach uninvited and die, unless the king extends the golden scepter. And Esther, who had not been summoned for 30 days, had no guarantee that the scepter would be extended. The response of Mordecai to Esther's message is one of the most theologically rich passages in the entire book. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Esther 4 verses 13 to 14. For such a time as this. The phrase that has echoed across centuries of human history as one of the most powerful expressions of divine providence in the biblical vocabulary. Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Mordecai was not saying he knew God's purposes with certainty. He was asking the question that the entire sequence of events, Vashti's refusal, the empire-wide search, Esther's extraordinary favor, the coronation, the concealed identity, was forcing onto the surface. Was it possible that the seemingly random sequence of events that had brought a Jewish orphan girl to the throne of the Persian Empire had a purpose behind it? Was it possible that the timing, the decree issued, the position occupied, the identity concealed but intact, was not coincidence but providence? Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The question did not demand certainty. It demanded faith. It demanded the willingness to act as if the possibility of divine purpose were real, to risk the death that the law of the empire decreed for the uninvited approach on the basis of the possibility that the God of Israel had been working through every circumstance of Esther's life to bring her to exactly this moment for exactly this purpose. For such a time as this. Not for the ease and the luxury and the security of the palace. Not for the crown and the favor and the elevation. For this. For the moment when her people needed someone in the position she occupied, with the access she had, with the courage she was about to demonstrate. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa, and hold a fast on my behalf, and do not eat or do not drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as I do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish." Esther 4 verses 15 to 16. If I perish, I perish. 4 words. Among the most courageous 4 words in the entire biblical narrative. Not, I am confident I will succeed. Not, I have a plan that will work. Not, God has told me the king will extend the scepter. If I perish, I perish. The full acknowledgement of the risk, combined with the complete commitment to take the risk anyway. She was not acting from certainty about the outcome. She was acting from clarity about the obligation. Her people needed her. The moment required her. And whether she lived or died in the attempt, she was going to make it. Fast for me. 3 days. Night and day. The entire Jewish community of Susa, gathered in the solidarity of fasting and prayer on behalf of the woman who was about to walk into the inner court of the Persian king without being summoned. The Book of Esther does not say they prayed, the word prayer does not appear, just as God's name does not appear. But fasting in the biblical tradition was never merely the abstention from food. It was always the physical expression of the soul's turning toward God, the embodiment of the petition that could not be articulated, the declaration of dependence on the only one who could determine the outcome of what was about to happen. 3 days of the community's fasting and 3 days of Esther's own fasting, and then the moment that everything had been building toward. On the 3rd day Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters, while the king was sitting on his royal throne inside the throne room opposite the entrance to the palace. Esther 5 verse 1, on the 3rd day. 3 days of fasting. 3 days of the community's prayer expressed in the physical discipline of abstention. 3 days of preparation, not merely the preparation of strategy but the preparation of the soul, the alignment of the inner life with the enormous external act that was about to be performed. And on the 3rd day, Esther put on her royal robes. The detail is significant and deliberate. She did not go to the king in sackcloth as Mordecai had been wearing. She did not go disheveled or weeping or in the outward expression of the grief that the decree had produced in the Jewish community. She put on her royal robes. The queen's garments. The visible expression of the position she occupied. She was going to the king not as a suppliant stripped of dignity but as a queen, using every dimension of the identity and the position that the extraordinary sequence of events had given her, presenting herself in the fullness of who she had become rather than in the diminishment of who she feared to be seen as. She stood in the inner court. The space between the outer court and the throne room itself, the liminal zone, the in-between place, the threshold that the law of the empire decreed was deadly to cross uninvited. She stood there. In her royal robes. With the decree against her people in the background and the golden scepter in the king's hand ahead of her and 3 days of fasting and the community's solidarity behind her and the question of Mordecai still ringing in her memory, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And when the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight, and he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter. Esther 5 verse 2, he held out the golden scepter. The action that determined whether Esther lived or died, the extension of the king's golden scepter as the signal of his acceptance of her uninvited approach, happened. Not because the law required it. Not because Esther had guaranteed it. Because the king saw her and she won favor in his sight. The same favor that had characterized every significant encounter in Esther's story, the favor with Haggai, the favor with all who saw her, the favor with the king at the original coronation, was present again in the moment of highest risk and highest need. She won favor in his sight. And he held out the golden scepter. And the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given you, even to the half of my kingdom." Esther 5 verse 3, even to the half of my kingdom. The extravagance of the king's offer communicated the depth of his regard for the woman who had just stood in his inner court. Whatever she wanted, up to half the kingdom, she could have. The moment Esther had risked her life to reach had arrived. The king was asking. The scepter had been extended. She was alive. And she had the full attention of the most powerful man in the ancient world. And Esther said, "If it please the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I have prepared for the king." Esther 5 verse 4, a feast. Not the request everyone, including perhaps the reader, was expecting. Not the immediate revelation of the decree and the plea for her people's deliverance. A feast. The response of Esther to the king's offer of half the kingdom was an invitation to dinner. The strategy Esther was deploying was not the strategy of direct confrontation, not the immediate presentation of the crisis and the demand for justice. It was the strategy of relationship, of the carefully prepared context, of the moment chosen with precision. Esther understood that the king's favor, while real, required cultivation. That the request she needed to make, a request that would require the king to reverse a decree made with his own signet ring, to acknowledge that his most trusted adviser had deceived him, to act against a man he had elevated above all other officials, was a request that needed to be made in exactly the right moment and in exactly the right way. A feast. First. Then the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has said." So the king and Haman came to the feast that Esther had prepared. And as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king said to Esther, "What is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Esther 5 verses 5 to 6, again the offer. Again the opening. And again, Esther did not take it. Not yet. And Esther answered, "My wish and my request is, if I have found favor in the sight of the king, and if it please the king to grant my wish and fulfill my request, let the king and Haman come to the feast that I will prepare for them, and tomorrow I will do as the king has said." Esther 5 verses 7 to 8, tomorrow. Another feast. Another delay. The second invitation communicated Esther's extraordinary self-possession in a moment when urgency must have been screaming within her. The decree was in effect, the day of execution was 11 months away but approaching. The man who had planned the genocide of her people was sitting at her table drinking wine. And Esther said, "Tomorrow." Not from timidity. Not from indecision. But from the wisdom of a woman who knew that the moment had to be exactly right, that the king's heart had to be fully prepared, that the context had to be perfectly constructed for the request that would require him to do something enormously difficult. Then Haman went out that day joyful and glad of heart. But when Haman saw Mordecai in the king's gate, that he neither rose nor trembled before him, he was filled with wrath against Mordecai. Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home, and he sent and brought his friends and his wife Zeresh. And Haman recounted to them the splendor of his riches, the number of his sons, all the promotions with which the king had honored him, and how he had advanced him above the officials and the servants of the king. Then Haman said, "Even Queen Esther let no one but me come with the king to the feast she prepared. And tomorrow also I am invited by her together with the king. Yet all this is worth nothing to me, so long as I see Mordecai the Jew sitting at the king's gate." Esther 5 verses 9-13. Yet all this is worth nothing to me. The self-revelation of Haman in this moment is among the most psychologically precise portraits of pride and hatred in the entire biblical narrative. He had everything: riches, sons, promotion, the favor of the king, the exclusive invitation of the queen. And it was all worth nothing because of one man who would not bow. The comprehensiveness of Haman's blessing and the comprehensiveness of his discontentment were directly proportional to each other. The more he had, the more intolerable was the single thing he did not have. The homage of Mordecai. The bow that the Jewish man at the king's gate refused to give. The hatred that had expanded from one man to an entire people was now consuming the man who bore it, making everything else, wealth, honor, the queen's invitation, worthless in its shadow. Then his wife Zeresh and all his friends said to him, "Let a gallows 50 cubits high be made, and in the morning tell the king to have Mordecai hanged upon it. Then go joyfully with the king to the feast." This idea pleased Haman, and he had the gallows made. Esther 5 verse 14, 50 cubits. Approximately 75 feet, a gallows of extraordinary and deliberate height, designed to be visible across the city of Susa, the public execution of the man who would not bow made visible to everyone. Haman had it built. That night, in preparation for the morning when he would ask the king's permission to hang Mordecai on it. On that night the king could not sleep. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Esther 6 verse 1, on that night. The night between the first feast and the second feast. The night when Haman was having a 75-foot gallows constructed in his courtyard. The night when Esther was still holding her request, waiting for the morning, waiting for the right moment. The king could not sleep. A sleepless king in the Persian Empire was not a minor thing. He had the resources of an entire empire available to address his sleeplessness, and the resource he reached for was the reading of the Chronicles. The official record of the empire. The book of memorable deeds. And it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs, who guarded the threshold, and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king said, "What honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this?" And the king's young men who attended him said, "Nothing has been done for him." Esther 6 verses 2-3, nothing has been done for him. The record that had been made and apparently forgotten, the service of Mordecai in saving the king's life, recorded in the Chronicles and left unrewarded, was being read aloud in the king's bedchamber on the one night when the king could not sleep, at the exact moment when the man who wanted Mordecai dead was in the outer court waiting to ask for permission to hang him. The timing of the sleepless king and the random opening of the Chronicles to exactly the right entry was the kind of coincidence that the Book of Esther deals in entirely, the kind of coincidence that accumulates across the entire narrative until it can no longer be called coincidence without straining the meaning of the word beyond its capacity. And the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that he had prepared for him. And the king's young men told him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." Esther 6 verses 4-5, let him come in. Haman, who had come to ask for Mordecai's death, was about to be asked for Mordecai's honor. The man who had built the 75-foot gallows the previous night was about to be instructed to lead the man he had planned to hang through the city on horseback in the king's own robes. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor?" And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" So Haman said to the king, "For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that the king has ridden, and on whose head a royal crown has been set. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Esther 6 verses 6-9. The trap Haman walked into was constructed of his own pride. He assumed the honor was for himself. And so he designed the most extravagant public honor he could imagine: royal robes, the king's own horse, a crown, proclamation through the square of the city. He designed it for himself. And then the king said, "Hurry. Take the robes and the horse, as you have said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned." Esther 6 verse 10. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. The man who had planned to ask for Mordecai's execution was now commanded to execute the most lavish public honor available in the empire, for Mordecai. The reversal was total, immediate, and deeply humiliating. Haman, who had come to the court to secure the death of his enemy, was now leading that enemy through the city on the king's horse in the king's robes, proclaiming before him, "Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor." Every step of the procession through the square of the city was a step away from the execution he had planned and toward the destruction of everything he had built. Every word of the proclamation he was required to speak was a word that tasted like ash in his mouth. And Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman hurried to his house, mourning and with his head covered. And Haman told his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and his wife Zeresh said to him, "If Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of the Jewish people, you will not overcome him but will surely fall before him." Esther 6 verses 12-13, "You will not overcome him but will surely fall before him." The counsel of Haman's own advisers and his own wife, delivered in the ashes of the morning's humiliation, was a recognition of what the entire sequence of events had been communicating. Something was working against Haman that exceeded his planning and his power. Something was protecting Mordecai and the people of Mordecai with an effectiveness that the human instruments of Haman's hatred could not overcome. The advisers named it in the most careful possible language: "If Mordecai is of the Jewish people." If the God of the Jewish people was engaged in this conflict, Haman was not going to win it. While they were yet talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried to bring Haman to the feast that Esther had prepared. Esther 6 verse 14, the feast. The second feast. The moment Esther had been preparing for since she had put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court. The moment that 3 days of fasting had preceded and a night of providential sleeplessness had prepared. Haman arrived at Esther's feast from the humiliation of leading Mordecai through the city in the king's robes. And the king and Haman came to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther?" "It shall be granted you." "And what is your request?" "Even to the half of my kingdom, it shall be fulfilled." Esther 7 verses 1-2. The third time the offer had been made. The moment Esther had waited for, had risked her life for, had fasted for, had prepared 2 feasts for, had arrived. And this time, she spoke. Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Esther 7 verses 3-4, let my life be granted me for my wish. The revelation was devastating in its personal framing. Esther did not begin with an abstract petition for justice. She began with her own life. My life. My people. We have been sold. The decree of destruction that Haman had purchased with 10,000 talents of silver was a decree that included the queen herself, a fact the king did not know until this moment, a fact that Esther was now placing before him with the full emotional weight of a woman speaking about her own death. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he, who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and enemy. This wicked Haman." Esther 7 verses 5-6, this wicked Haman. The man sitting at the table. The man the king had trusted above all his other officials. The man who had been at every feast, who had been elevated above every servant of the empire, who had received the king's own signet ring to execute his plan, this man was the enemy of the queen and the author of the decree of genocide against her people. And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. Esther 7 verses 6-7, he begged Esther for his life. The man who had planned the genocide of her people, who had built a 75-foot gallows for her cousin, who had come to the feast riding the wave of his own pride and the humiliation of the morning's forced honor, was now begging the Jewish woman whose people he had tried to destroy for the preservation of his own life. The reversal was complete in every dimension. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" As the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance on the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word saved the king, it stands at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." Esther 7 verses 8-9, hang him on that. The gallows Haman had built for Mordecai became the instrument of Haman's own execution. The 75 feet of wood erected in Haman's courtyard with such confident malice, the structure designed to be visible across Susa as the public declaration of Mordecai's death, was now the structure on which Haman himself was hanged. So they hanged Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the wrath of the king abated. Esther 7 verse 10. The wrath of the king abated. The first great reversal was complete. The man who had plotted genocide was dead on the gallows he had built for his intended victim. The king's anger, redirected from the queen's uninvited approach to the man who had deceived him and used his authority to plan the destruction of the queen's people, had found its object and been satisfied. But the decree was still in effect. The letters had been sent throughout the empire. The 13th day of Adar was still approaching. And the death of Haman, while the removal of the primary human agent of the persecution, did not automatically reverse the imperial decree that bore the king's seal. On that day King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. Esther 8 verses 1-2, the signet ring. The same ring that had sealed the decree of genocide when the king gave it to Haman was now on the finger of Mordecai, the man whom Haman had tried to hang on a 75-foot gallows. The instrument of destruction had become the instrument of authority for the man the destruction was aimed at. The house of Haman, his wealth, his property, his entire material legacy, had been transferred to Esther. And Mordecai, whom Esther had finally publicly revealed as her guardian and the closest thing to a father she had known, was now elevated to the position that Haman had occupied. The personal reversals were complete and comprehensive. But the institutional problem remained. The decree was still in effect. Then Esther spoke again before the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot that he had devised against the Jews. Esther 8 verse 3, she fell at his feet and wept. The queen who had entered the inner court with such composed and royal dignity, who had put on her royal robes and stood before the king without weeping, who had managed 2 feasts and the revelation of Haman's conspiracy with extraordinary self-possession, now fell at the king's feet and wept. The self-possession had not been the absence of feeling. It had been the discipline of feeling in the service of purpose. And now, with Haman dead and the personal danger past but the decree still threatening her people, the grief that had been held in careful discipline through the weeks of fasting and planning and waiting expressed itself in the most direct and personal way available to her. She fell at his feet. She wept. She pleaded. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king. And she said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred?" Esther 8 verses 4-6, How can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? The personal anguish that had been concealed beneath the strategic patience of the 2 feasts was now fully visible. The queen who had been Hadassah the Jewish orphan before she was Esther the Persian queen was speaking from the depth of her identity as a member of the people whose destruction was still legally decreed. My people. My kindred. The identity she had been commanded to conceal was now the identity she was most fully claiming. In the presence of the king, in the throne room of the most powerful empire in the ancient world, a Jewish woman was saying, "These are my people and I cannot bear to see them destroyed." Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, "Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked." Esther 8 verses 7-8, You may write as you please. The authority given to Esther and Mordecai was the same authority that had been given to Haman, "Write what you wish, in the king's name, sealed with the king's ring." The same mechanism that had produced the decree of genocide was now being made available to produce the decree of deliverance. The institution of imperial decree-making was the same. The signet ring was the same. The authority was the same. Everything that Haman had been given to destroy the Jews was now being given to Mordecai and Esther to save them. The king's scribes were summoned at that time, in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written, according to all that Mordecai commanded, about the Jews, to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script and to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. Esther 8 verse 9, From India to Ethiopia. The same geographic scope as the original decree of destruction, the same empire-wide reach, the same comprehensive coverage of every province and every people in every language. The decree that had gone out in Haman's time had reached every corner of the empire. The decree that Mordecai was now writing would reach every corner of the empire as well. The scope of the salvation would match the scope of the threatened destruction. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent the letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods, with the day appointed for this in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. Esther 8 verses 10-12, the same day. The 13th day of Adar, the day that the original decree had designated for the destruction of the Jews, was now also the day designated by the new decree for the Jews' defense of themselves. The day that had been the appointed date of their annihilation was now the day on which they were legally authorized to defend their lives against anyone who came against them. The very date of their destruction had been transformed into the date of their empowerment. A copy of what was written was to be issued as a decree in every province and publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers, mounted on their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command. And the decree was issued in Susa the citadel. Esther 8 verses 13 to 14, the urgency communicated in the sending of the couriers, hurriedly, urged by the king's command, was the urgency of a situation where time mattered, where the decree needed to reach every province with enough lead time for the Jewish communities scattered throughout the empire to receive it and prepare. The swift horses and the urgent dispatch were the physical expression of the race between the first decree and the second, between the sentence of destruction and the permission for defense. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in every province and in every city, wherever the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many from the peoples of the land became Jews, for fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Esther 8 verses 15 to 17. Light and gladness and joy and honor. The mourning that had spread through every province when the first decree was issued, the sackcloth and ashes and the loud and bitter cry that had characterized the Jewish community's response to Haman's decree, was now reversed. In every city, wherever the second decree reached, the mourning gave way to celebration. The feast and the holiday. The joy that could only be fully appreciated by people who had been looking at the date of their own planned annihilation and were now looking at a decree that transformed that date into the occasion of their survival. And many from the peoples of the land became Jews. The response of the surrounding population to the reversal that had just occurred, to the extraordinary sequence of events that had turned the planned genocide into the celebration of deliverance, was conversion. Many people identified themselves with the people of the God who had accomplished this reversal. The salvation of the Jewish people was not merely their own survival. It became the occasion for others to recognize in the God who had worked through Esther's courage and Mordecai's faithfulness a reality worth aligning themselves with. Now in the 12th month, which is the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on the very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, the reverse occurred. The Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. Esther 9 verse 1, the reverse occurred. The phrase that summarizes the entire theological movement of the Book of Esther, the reverse occurred. The day that had been planned as the day of the Jews' destruction became the day of their deliverance. The people who had been designated for annihilation were the people who prevailed. The decree that had been designed to end their existence became the occasion of their survival. The reverse occurred. And this reversal, this comprehensive, empire-wide, legally structured reversal of the planned destruction of an entire people, was accomplished not through military power or divine miracle visible to the external eye. It was accomplished through the courage of a woman who risked her life to speak. Through the wisdom of an older man who understood that the moment required action and who asked the question that changed everything, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Through the providential chain of events that had brought a Jewish orphan girl to the throne of the Persian Empire and kept her there for exactly the moment when her people needed someone in exactly that position with exactly that access and exactly that courage. Mordecai recorded these events and sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, obligating them to keep the 14th day of the month Adar and also the 15th day of the same, year by year, as the days on which the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month that had been turned for them from sorrow into gladness and from mourning into a holiday. They were to make them days of feasting and gladness, days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Esther 9 verses 20 to 22, the institution of Purim. Named for the pur, the lot that Haman had cast to determine the most auspicious day for the destruction of the Jews, the festival of Purim became the annual celebration of the reversal that had turned the lot-determined day of destruction into the day of deliverance. Named for the instrument of the enemy's planning. Celebrating the God who took the enemy's instrument of determination and reversed its outcome. Days of feasting and gladness. Days for sending gifts of food to one another and gifts to the poor. The celebration of Purim was not merely the commemoration of survival. It was the active, communal, practical expression of the joy of deliverance, shared through food and gifts, extended to the poor who might not otherwise have cause for feasting, made communal rather than private because the deliverance had been communal. The entire Jewish community throughout the empire had fasted together before the crisis. They would feast together in its aftermath. The solidarity that had expressed itself in the fast was now expressing itself in the feast. So Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, and Mordecai the Jew gave full written authority, confirming this second letter about Purim. Letters were sent to all the Jews, to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, in words of peace and truth, to confirm these days of Purim at their appointed seasons, as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had obligated them, and as they had obligated themselves and their offspring, with regard to their fasts and their lamenting. The command of Esther confirmed these practices of Purim, and it was recorded in writing. Esther 9 verses 29 to 32. Recorded in writing. The book that had begun with a record, the Chronicles read to a sleepless king, ended with a record. The writing that had preserved the memory of Mordecai's service was the writing that had precipitated the chain of events leading to Haman's humiliation and death. And now the writing of Esther and Mordecai preserved the memory of the deliverance itself, ensuring that every subsequent generation of the Jewish people would know what had happened in the Persian Empire, would know the name of Haman and the name of Esther, would know the story of the decree and the fast and the courage of the queen who risked death to save her people. And King Ahasuerus imposed tax on the land and on the coastlands of the sea. And all the acts of his power and might, and the full account of the high honor of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? For Mordecai the Jew was second in rank to King Ahasuerus, and he was great among the Jews and popular with the multitude of his brothers, for he sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. Esther 10 verses 2 to 3, second in rank to King Ahasuerus. The man who had been sitting at the king's gate in sackcloth and ashes was now second in rank in the most powerful empire on earth. The man Haman had wanted to hang on a 75-foot gallows was now the most powerful Jewish official in the history of the Persian period. The reversal that had begun with a sleepless king and a chronicle open to the right page had produced an outcome that exceeded anything that Mordecai or Esther could have planned or hoped for in the depths of the mourning that had followed the first decree. He sought the welfare of his people and spoke peace to all his people. The summary of Mordecai's character and his legacy, not his rank or his power or the material wealth that Esther had transferred to him from the house of Haman. The welfare of his people. Peace to all his people. The man whose name meant little man or warrior, the Benjaminite of the exile who had raised his orphan cousin as his own daughter and had refused to bow to Haman and had walked every day along the perimeter of the court to learn how Esther was remembered not for what he achieved for himself but for what he sought for others. The story of Esther ends with Mordecai second in rank to the king and the Jewish people celebrating throughout the empire. But the story does not end there in the sense that matters most, in the sense of what it means and what it communicates and what it has continued to say to every generation of God's people who have read it across the millennia since it was written. Because the Book of Esther is not merely a historical record of an extraordinary deliverance in the Persian period. It is a theological document, a carefully constructed narrative that communicates profound truths about the character of God, the nature of divine providence, the cost of human courage, and the extraordinary way that God works through the ordinary choices of faithful people to accomplish purposes that exceed anything human planning or human power could achieve. The most striking feature of the Book of Esther is the feature that has most occupied biblical scholars and theologians across centuries of careful study, the absence of God's name. In the entire book, from the first verse to the last, the name of God does not appear. Not once. Neither the divine name nor the word for God in its Hebrew forms appears in the text of Esther. And yet the presence of God is everywhere in the story, in the timing, in the reversals, in the coincidences that pile up with such systematic consistency that they can no longer be called coincidences, in the extraordinary chain of cause and effect that connects a queen's refusal to bow at a feast to the salvation of an entire people scattered across the most powerful empire in the ancient world. The hiddenness of God in the Book of Esther is not the absence of God. It is a specific and deliberate theological statement about how God works in the world, not always through the spectacular and the visible and the obviously supernatural, not always through parting seas and burning bushes and audible voices from heaven, but through the ordinary mechanisms of human life and human choice and human circumstance. Through a king who cannot sleep. Through a chronicle open to the right page. Through the favor that a young woman wins in the eyes of everyone she meets. Through the courage of a woman who stands in an inner court in her royal robes and waits for a golden scepter. Through the question asked by an older man who understood that the moment required action, who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this? The hiddenness of God in Esther is the hiddenness of God in most human experience. Most people, most of the time, do not encounter God in the spectacular and the obviously supernatural. They encounter him in exactly the ways the Book of Esther describes, in the timing of events that should not align but do, in the connections that are made that should not have been made, in the positions occupied at the moment they are needed, in the courage that rises in a person who has every reason to stay silent but chooses instead to speak. The Book of Esther is, in this sense, the most realistic theological document in the Old Testament, the one that most closely mirrors the experience of most believers in most generations, who live not in the era of the Exodus but in the era of the exile, not with the pillar of cloud and fire but with the silent, unseen, unnamed presence of a God who is working through every circumstance toward purposes that will only be fully visible in retrospect. The festival of Purim that the Book of Esther establishes has been celebrated by Jewish communities for over 2,000 years. The annual reading of the scroll of Esther, with the community's ritual noise making every time Haman's name is mentioned, the costumes, the gifts of food, the charity to the poor, is one of the most joyful occasions in the Jewish liturgical calendar. And its joy is rooted specifically in the kind of salvation the book describes, not the miraculous salvation of the Exodus, not the dramatic salvation of the Red Sea crossing, but the salvation accomplished through human courage and divine providence working together in the ordinary mechanisms of political and personal life. The celebration of Purim is the celebration of the hidden God who was present and working even when his name was not spoken. The story of Esther also speaks with particular power to the theology of vocation, of the calling that comes with position and privilege. The question Mordecai asked, "Who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this?" is a question that every person who occupies a position of influence or access or opportunity is confronted with in the moments when that position is needed for a purpose beyond personal benefit. The position of queen was not given to Esther for her own comfort or security. The access to the king was not given to her for her own advancement. The favor she found in the eyes of all who saw her was not given to her for her own gratification. The entire sequence of events that had brought her to the throne of the Persian Empire had a purpose that was only revealed in the moment of crisis, and the question was whether she would recognize that purpose and act on it or whether she would remain in the safety of the palace while her people were destroyed outside its walls. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. The remarkable confidence of Mordecai's statement deserves careful attention. He did not say, "If you keep silent, your people will perish." He said, "If you keep silent, relief and deliverance will rise from another place." The deliverance of the Jewish people was not dependent on Esther's courage. God did not need Esther to accomplish his purposes. He is God, the God who had brought Israel out of Egypt and sustained them through the Babylonian exile and would sustain them through whatever came next. Relief and deliverance would rise from another place if Esther kept silent. But you and your father's house will perish. The question was not whether the Jewish people would be saved. The question was whether Esther would be the instrument of that salvation or whether she would miss the purpose for which she had been placed in exactly that position at exactly that moment. The theological implication is both encouraging and sobering. Encouraging, because it communicates that God's purposes are not frustrated by human cowardice or human failure. If one instrument proves unavailable, another will be found. The deliverance will come. The purposes of God will be accomplished. Sobering, because it communicates that the opportunity to be the instrument of those purposes is not permanent and unlimited. Esther had a choice. She could keep silent and remain safe in the palace. Or she could speak and risk death and be the person through whom the salvation came. The choice she made, if I perish, was the choice that made her the instrument. And the choice she might have made, the choice of silence, the choice of self-preservation, the choice to remain behind the palace walls while her people were destroyed, would have resulted not in the failure of God's purposes but in the forfeiture of her own role in those purposes. The New Testament writer of Hebrews, listing the great cloud of witnesses whose faith the community of believers is called to emulate, included among the heroes of the faith those who, through faith, enforced justice, obtained promises, stopped the mouths of lions, quenched the power of fire, escaped the edge of the sword, were made strong out of weakness, became mighty in war, put foreign armies to flight. Hebrews 11 verses 33-34, Esther's story fits within this testimony even though her name does not appear in the list, because the faith she demonstrated was precisely the faith of someone who acted on the possibility of divine purpose when all the visible evidence suggested that silence was the safer and more reasonable option. She was made strong out of weakness. The orphan girl in the foreign court, without family connections or political power or any guarantee of the king's favor, was made strong enough to stand in the inner court in her royal robes and wait for a golden scepter. The strength was not her own. It was the strength of a woman who had fasted 3 days and sent word to Mordecai, "Go, gather all the Jews and hold a fast on my behalf," and had placed herself in the hands of the God whose name the book does not mention but whose presence pervades every page of it. Esther also stands in a specific and important relationship to the great theme of substitutionary love that runs through the entire biblical narrative. She risked her life for her people. She stood in the gap between her people and the decree that would have destroyed them. She went into the presence of the one whose power could determine their fate and made her own fate contingent on theirs. If I perish, I perish. The willingness to place oneself in the position of risk for the sake of others, to use the access and the privilege and the position one occupies not for personal benefit but for the protection of the vulnerable, to stand between the threatened and the threat, all of this is the shadow of a greater substitution, a greater standing in the gap, a greater willingness to risk everything for the people who needed someone to speak on their behalf. Jesus, in the letter to the Hebrews, is described as the one who always lives to make intercession for the people he has redeemed. Hebrews 7 verse 25, the intercessor who approaches the throne not for his own benefit but for the benefit of those whose case he carries. The one who comes before the ultimate authority not uninvited, for he is the Son, but in the fullness of his identification with the people he represents. Esther approaching the throne of Ahasuerus for the sake of her people is, in the long typological tradition of biblical theology, a human and partial reflection of the divine intercession, the one who stands before the ultimate throne and says, "These are my people, let their lives be granted to me for my wish," and who ensures that the decree of death against them is answered by a greater decree of life. The Book of Esther ends, but the questions it raises do not end with it. The question of what to do when the moment requires courage and silence is safer. That question does not belong only to the Persian period. It belongs to every generation in which God's people find themselves in positions of influence and access, and the moment arrives when those positions are needed for a purpose beyond personal comfort. The question of whether to risk the comfortable security of the palace for the sake of those outside it. The question of whether to speak when speaking is dangerous and silence is safe. The question of whether the position one occupies was given for such a time as this, and whether the answer to that question will be the courage of Esther or the silence that Mordecai warned against. For such a time as this. The phrase has outlived the Persian Empire by 2.5 millennia. It has been spoken over every generation of God's people who found themselves in positions of unusual access or influence at moments of unusual crisis. It has been the question asked of the person who had the ear of the powerful when justice required that the powerful hear something they did not want to hear. It has been the challenge extended to the person whose identity or position or relationship gave them access to a door that others could not open, a door through which the safety of the vulnerable might be secured if the person with access had the courage of Esther rather than the silence that Mordecai warned would lead to personal destruction even as it failed to prevent divine deliverance. The Jewish people were saved. The decree of Haman was reversed by the decree of Mordecai and Esther. The day that had been appointed for their destruction became the day of their defense and their deliverance. The pur that Haman had cast, the lot that had determined the date of the planned genocide, gave its name to the festival that celebrated the reversal of everything the lot had been intended to accomplish. For in the hands of the God who works through sleepless kings and open chronicles and the favor of a young woman in a foreign court, even the lot falls where he determines. Even the instrument of the enemy's planning becomes the name of the celebration of the enemy's defeat. Even the gallows built for the righteous becomes the gallows of the unrighteous. Even the decree sealed with the king's ring against God's people becomes the occasion for a second decree, sealed with the same ring, in favor of God's people. The reverse occurred. The three words that summarize the Book of Esther summarize the character of the God who works through it. The God of the Exodus is also the God of the exile. The God who parts seas is also the God who opens chronicles to the right page in the bedroom of a sleepless king. The God who speaks from burning bushes is also the God who works through the courage of a queen who says if I perish, and walks into an inner court in her royal robes and waits for a golden scepter. The God whose name does not appear in the Book of Esther is the same God whose name fills every other page of the biblical record, present, working, purposeful, sovereign over every circumstance that human pride and human hatred and human power can construct, able to reverse what has been decreed and to transform the day of destruction into the day of deliverance. The queen who risked death to save her people became the most celebrated woman in the Jewish liturgical calendar, her story read aloud every year in the synagogues of every generation, her name spoken with the same reverence given to the great heroes of the faith. Her courage held up as the model of what it looks like when a person in a position of privilege and access recognizes the purpose for which that privilege was given and acts on it regardless of the personal cost. Hadassah. Esther. The Jewish girl and the Persian queen. The orphan raised by her cousin and the woman who wore the royal crown of the most powerful empire in the ancient world. The one who had been commanded to conceal her identity and the one who finally revealed it in the one moment when the revelation was the only thing that could save her people. If I perish, I perish. The most courageous sentence in the book. The sentence that contains within it the entire theology of sacrificial love, the willingness to place one's own life in the balance for the sake of others, to accept the possibility of the worst outcome in pursuit of the best purpose, to act from clarity about the obligation rather than certainty about the outcome. She did not know the king would extend the scepter. She did not know the fasting of 3 days would be enough. She did not know that Haman had already been humiliated that morning, that the gallows he had built would be his own instrument of execution, that the signet ring would be transferred to Mordecai, that the day of destruction would become the day of deliverance. She did not know any of it. She knew only that her people needed her, and that the position she occupied had been given, perhaps, who knows, perhaps, for such a time as this. And on that perhaps, on that who knows, she staked her life. And the God whose name the book does not mention honored the staking of it. Extended the scepter. Provided the reversal. Saved the people. And ensured that the story would be told and retold and celebrated and wept over and shouted about in the noise of the Purim reading for as long as there were Jewish people in the world to tell it, which is to say, forever. This concludes the full documentary story of Esther.